Okay.
Hello and welcome to this video. And on this video, we're going to be asking the question, was Frank Zappa a proper composer? Like Beethoven or Mozart or, I don't know, Mantovani, James Last? What was he closest to as a composer? And I am very honored to have two of the most knowledgeable people I know on the subject of Frank Zappa. We have Shannon Hansbal with us here today, which some of you may know by watching his incredible YouTube channel, where he goes into such depth about the technical aspects and cultural aspects of Frank Zappa. It's a much must watch for any Zappa fan. He also happens to be one of the best guitarists I've ever seen as well. So he's a phenomenal musician. And then we also have Geoff Wills with us today. Hello, Geoff.
Hello there.
I didn't say hello to you, Shannon. Hello, Shannon.
Hi, Andy. No
And
problem.
Geoff is the author of. I was nearly. He's the author of. I'll have to put it there. This
Wrong
one
book.
here, great book, which looks at the it's a trouble when you have a background. That one there looks at the history of the saxophone in movie soundtracks. But more interesting for us today, he's also the author of this book here. I'll try and stand up a little bit there so we can see it. Oh God, which is called "Did It Really Smell Funny, Frank?" Frank Zappa and Jazz. And Geoff has got a take on Zappa, which I find very, very interesting, and actually makes him more understandable in my view. So it's brilliant to have you two gentlemen here today. So I've got a little bit of a structure here, which I don't normally have. But I want to sort of run through these six sort of questions, I suppose. So to start off, shall we define what we mean by proper? And Shannon, do you want to kick off with what your definition of proper is? What we're trying to get to on this video?
Well, I guess there are many sort of definitions of proper. As you mentioned earlier on, from your perspective, proper might imply was Zappa the same caliber as Beethoven or Mozart. Well, I don't know. I wouldn't want to be too presumptuous to answer that question, but I think he was definitely an interesting, capable composer, a brilliant composer, and endlessly fascinating in so many different ways. I mean, there are so
Would
many
it
things.
be, sorry to jump in, would it be fairer to try and nail who we would be comparing to? So if you were looking at his sort of contemporary, I mean, his contemporaries would be people like Philip Glass, I suppose, and Steve Reich. They would be the what people call, because it's not really classical, is he? But they're the sort of classical composers. So um, I think that's where I would place him. Yeah, he's a great rock musician, but in when people come back and look at orchestral music or composed music or whatever you're going to say, are they going to mention Frank Zappa in the same breath as a Pierre Boulez or Ferres or Philip Glass or Steve Reich? I think that would be a fair, definition of what we're trying to go to. Would you say that, Shannon?
Possibly, I think so. I mean, I think it's gaining ground in terms of him being recognized as a serious composer, maybe more so now, and there are young musicians and orchestras playing his music, maybe not as often as I'd like to hear it, but definitely he's been sort of acknowledged and people are aware of what a great composer he was. So I definitely think that's gaining ground, most certainly.
That's a very interesting point about repertoire, isn't it?
Yeah.
We'll have to come back to that because I think it's very interesting to discuss the fact that people are putting his repertoire on the program, but of course that's more likely because of commercial reasons, because a Zappa composition might bring a wider range of people in. But is that an attribute of his music that actually is very good in that he's brought a lot of people who wouldn't listen to modern classical music to that genre? So, Geoff, what you before we came on, you were saying you were talking about that you've changed your opinion about Zappa as a composer, and you were mentioning some of the stuff that has come out of Shannon's studies. So, do you want to pick up from there?
Um, yeah, I was going to say, with regard to Zappa and jazz, I think in a funny way, Zappa, he resembled kind of a more modern Gunter Schuller, who along with John Lewis, kind of invented or created third stream music. And you've got this stream between classical and jazz. But with regard to Zappa, he's obviously also incorporated many aspects of pop and rock as well. And everything was fair game. You mentioned previously, was he more like Stravinsky and Varese, or was he more like people like George Russell and Mingus? Well, I think he was equally close to all those people. He was such a personality that he covered the whole spectrum in effect. So I think a good way to look at Zappa is to say that he was a more contemporary third stream musician. He got the whole thing covered.
Geoff, could you explain for the audience who doesn't know what third stream is? Could you just go into a little depth of what that is and the history of it?
Yeah, third stream music was it's a term invented by Gunter Schuller. Gunter Schuller initially was a classical musician, a French horn player, but he turned up playing with Miles Davis on the Birth of the Cool album, and he became a very eminent figure in the field of jazz education. He became the director of one of the most famous colleges in America. And along with John Lewis, who ran the Modern Jazz Quartet, they coined the phrase third stream, whereby they tried to combine or amalgamate aspects of classical music and modern jazz. And Gunter Schuller carried out quite a lot of very interesting experiments using people like Ornette Coleman and Eric Dolphy. So, and from there, the phrase took off. Lots of people adopted it. A lot of people thought it was quite controversial. Some people said, oh, this is rubbish, you can't combine jazz and classical music. But gradually, I think it's become more accepted. And I think there are other people, let's say somebody like Stan Kenton, in his own way, created a type of third stream music with his innovations in modern music orchestra in the 1950s and other experiments later on. So that's broadly what third stream music is about, this combination of aspects and elements from jazz, orchestral music, classical music, and coming up with a new hybrid. And I think in many ways, third stream music, it is sort of the norm, really. People are combining more and more elements from everywhere, more and more as time goes on. So I hope that kind of explains
Yeah,
it.
no, I mean, this is fascinating for me because I think when we start off, it would be very easy to try and compare him to just straight classical composers that work in a certain framework. And of course, we know he doesn't do that. But if we compare him to third stream composers, there's a whole bunch of things he does, even in his orchestral compositions, that they don't do because he is referencing culture so much more. And so, but what I find very interesting is that there's a mode of improvisation within the third stream composers, which would come through, say, George Russell, like Eric Dolphy, Don Ellis is another one, where the improvisation is a lot more angular and modern classical than it is swingy and jazzy. And I think that's an element that we see in Zappa's composition. So I think what we will, now we've defined what proper is, we're basically saying, is it proper like, modern classical orchestral music, or is it proper like proper jazz composers? We've got somewhere between of those two. So the second point I've got here to look at is let's try and nail Zappa's strengths as a composer, and then we'll have a look at the weaknesses. Because we are going to be a bit iconoclastic, I think. So, Shannon, you've gone into so much depth. What would you say be Zappa's strengths as a composer?
I think his strengths, one of his strengths is being able to take disparate elements and put them together and, sort of create these compositions that are really intriguing. It's not very easy to do that. If I just want to go back to what you mentioned about the jazz and classical sort of influence there, it's quite interesting because I think it's underestimated how much jazz musicians were influenced by classical music. back in the day. I mean, I know Duke Ellington was influenced by, classical composers. Charlie Parker was listening to Edgar Varese and Stravinsky. So it's quite, you talk about the third stream there, but it's quite interesting how it was already embedded in classical music. Many of the sort of advances in music theory during the 1940s and 50s, harmonic sort of systems in jazz were derived from classical music, as well as perhaps the George Russell's book, the Lydian chromatic concept.
I wanted to bring this up because obviously my knowledge of George Russell's concept isn't full, and I also am very aware that Zappa seemed to prefer the Lydian mode. I don't know if it's too simplistic to say, was Zappa pulling that sound from George Russell's explorations or
there
not?
was an article written a few years ago by Brett Clement. He's great. He's one of the sort of leading theorists on Frank Zappa, and he was a real influence when I was doing my PhD. And he's done a fantastic job of analyzing his music, not just his orchestral music, but his the whole oeuvre.
Shannon, can I just jump in and stop? Sorry to interrupt. It's just so the viewers get an idea. Can you tell the audience about your PhD? Because you are a doctor, aren't you?
I am. That's right.
So if I was coming to see you as a doctor, what would your specialism be?
Well, there are many things that I'm interested in, but in terms of the PhD, my PhD was based on the analysis of his orchestral music, essentially. And I chose orchestral pieces that had never been analyzed before, not to my knowledge anyway, really difficult pieces like Bobbin Dacron and Pedro's Dowry, pieces like that. So I wanted
you do have a doctorate in Zappa, don't you?
Yeah, I'm a doctor. I did a PhD on Frank Zappa. I thought if I was going to commit to a PhD, I was going to do it on something that was interesting and that would inform me as a composer too. That's what was really important to me.
So, if you're on an airplane and there was some sort of medical disaster and someone said, "Is there a doctor in the house?" Then if anybody needs to understand, how quintuplets can be nested inside septuplets, you're the man, aren't you?
I'll be able to help out there. Yeah.
Sorry to butt in, but yeah, this is Shannon's expertise really is incredible in this. So sorry to butt in. You probably forgot what you were talking about. But if you want to carry on.
No, I haven't forgotten. No. Thanks for pointing that out. I mean, it's really interesting because Clement had talked about the way Zappa had constructed his sort of modal music. As you said, there's a proclivity for the Lydian mode in his music. It's rampant. And he used concepts from George Russell's publication. George Russell's basic premise is that maybe the major scale shouldn't be the mother of all scales. Instead, it should be the Lydian mode, because there is a certain unity in the sound of the Lydian mode. I know I'm going to talk a bit about music theory. I hope I don't alienate anyone. I'm going to try to explain.
Well, I got to be honest. I've been doing such shallow and trite videos on my channel recently that it would be nice to actually flex the academic and do something that people can get their teeth into. So I'm quite happy to go into this, but it's also be aware that some people will be going, what's this Lydian mode they're talking? What they on about? And Geoff, I'd like to bring you in here because the reason why I think George Russell is so important is because when you look at his emergence, which is sort of early to mid 50s, isn't it? And he brings these ideas, late 40s, is it?
Yeah.
But the popularization of this method, which is really through Miles Davis, isn't it? Because he becomes very interested in this method, and the modal move that Miles does on Kind of Blue, people say has its results. And the thing is that Zappa comes up in that period, and I've always felt that once you get to the 1960s, another idea crops into jazz. As jazz education starts to get a hold, you have the emergence of the chord scale approach, which is normally how because George Russell's approach wasn't that, was it? It was much more avant-garde in a way, wasn't it? And Zappa's exactly the right age to have received that if he was aware. But if he did, he covered these influences up, didn't he, a little bit? Do you think?
He was very, he didn't like to give things away, that's true. Although I think Brett Clement says that there's no evidence that Zappa was actually aware of George Russell's work. He may have absorbed it unconsciously or brought it out of his own accord. I don't know what you think about that, Chanan.
Yeah, it's possible that, but I mean, I guess there are similarities in the approach and the way it's used, whether he was aware of him or not. I find it quite interesting reading that article because, I mean, just a basic overview or explanation, if you like, of the George Russell's book is that, you know, he saw the Lydian mode as being the kind of scale that had the most tonal gravity, if you like. You can build up stacked fifths, intervals of stacked fifths, using the Lydian mode to more of an extent than you can with a major scale. So, you know, you take, if you start with the note C, you go to a fifth above, you get G, D, A, E, B, F sharp. You have your fifths there. There's a tonal gravity to it. And so Clement is borrowing from this idea, not the whole concept. Obviously, there are certain things that don't work in its application to Zappa's music. But it's the idea that the fifth interval is a strong interval. In fact, Paul Hindemith talked about this in his publication from 1942. It's called The Craft of Musical Composition. And in that book, he talks about the prominence of the fifth. You know, if you have two notes, if you have a C and an F, a perfect fourth, Hindemith didn't see it as a perfect fourth. He said the gravity was the inversion of the perfect fourth. So you have C and F, you have the perfect fourth, you move the C to the top, you get F and C, which is a perfect fifth. And this makes sense because the overtone series, you have your fundamental, the first interval is an octave, the second interval is a perfect fifth. The perfect fifth comes before the perfect fourth, which, you know, that creates that problem, that gravity problem in the major scale. So it makes sense that the perfect fifth should be the strongest interval and that the Lydian mode could potentially be the mother of all scales as opposed to the major scale. I hope that makes sense. You know, using intervals in chords and melodies was a real concern for Zappa. He spent many years trying to figure out ways to create compositions that would establish some kind of continuity. He talks about weights, measured tensions and things like that. And it's interesting we're talking about the fifths because I mean, let's say the sus2 chord that he uses in his compositions, the sus2 chord is made up of the root, the second, and the fifth degree of the scale. So if you have C major, you've got C, D is the second note, and G is the fifth note. You play those three notes together, you get that classic Zappa sound. The intro to Idiot Bastard Son has that voicing as many other of his compositions do. And the interesting thing is if you reorganize the notes of that sus2 chord, you get stacked fifths. You know, if you take the, you know, if you move them around, so you take the G and you put it on, put the D on top of the G, you get the fifths there, you know, so you get C, G, D, sorry, you get the first, the fifth, and then if you put the D on top an octave higher, you get stacked fifths. It's the same with the sus4 chord. So the fifth always seems to permeate, even in his chord Bible later on when he devised these chords. He had a systematic approach to creating chords for the orchestral pieces. One of the salient voicings that you hear in those compositions is a Lydian voicing, and it's made up of a major third, two fifths, a semitone, and two fifths. I talk about this in my video, Zappa's Chord Bible. So if anybody's interested in this and want to investigate more, you can watch that video. But yeah, so that's the sum of it really in terms of the Lydian mode and trying to create balance in those very difficult compositions.
Well, what's interesting is if you go back culturally and look at what is happening in music at that time, we have in classical music, we obviously had a tonalism and you know serialism in music. So everyone's trying to explore the sort of a tonal, and then as the minimalists come in, suddenly they're back to tonal music in a completely different way. And the thing with the minimalists is they're dealing with the cadence in a completely different passion. So I feel at the end of the 50s, with the modal experiments of Miles Davis, Ornette Coleman, if we look at what's happening in compose music. I think I'll call it that for this video. In compose music, everyone's starting to rethink the cadence. And one of the things that Coltrane is doing at that point is he's with the Coltrane matrix is trying to take the 2-5-1, which is basically a movement in fourths. Really, it's a fifth movement in fourths if you think of the way it's dropping down. And that, if you extend that out, it goes through all 12 keys, and you feel like Coltrane's trying to bust the harmony out. And it's the same thing as if you stack fifths, you're going all the way around the clock, aren't you, through every single key. When you listen to, say, McCoy Tyner's harmonic approach in Coltrane's group with the quartal harmony, again, the stack fourths are going round, but in the other way, and that really lines up with this idea that the fourth is actually a fifth. So that's really interesting. Geoff, could you fill us in on, because I think this jazz thing is really interesting. This is the X factor on this video. Is I think we're looking at him as a composer and we're going, oh yeah, it might not be as simple as just saying, oh, we loved Varese and he brought these things, and it might not be coming from there. Geoff, can you tell us a little bit about the sort of jazz he was listening to pre-66? Because there's obviously jazz musicians mentioned on Freak Out, which is quite interesting. And why you think he covered this influence up? Because I find this fascinating in your book.
Why did he cover it up?
Yeah, so who was he aware? If he wasn't aware of George Russell, who was he aware of?
Well, he started listening to jazz records in his early teens, basically. I think he, as a personality, he was voracious. I'll kind of sidetrack a little bit here. From a psychological point of view, I think this is interesting. I think that Zappa, he was the absolute classic creative personality. And incidentally, in the late 40s, early 50s, there was a lot of research into the creative personality. And there was a guy called Donald McKinnon. He was a very eminent American psychologist just post-World War II. And he did a very big study of creativity, especially with eminent architects. And he came up with this idea. He said, the creative personality, the classic creative personality, uses intuitive perception, which is an indirect perception of the deeper meanings inherent in phenomena and situations. The average person, on the other hand, simply centers attention on existing facts. The creative personality looks expectantly for a link or bridge between that which is given and present and that which is not yet thought of, focusing habitually on possibilities. And McKinnon said, creative individuals display significant tolerance for apparently chaotic situations and expressed aversions to simplicity and symmetry. So Zappa, in my opinion, he was an absolutely classic example of that sort of person. He was a magpie. He was listening to and watching everything. And in his early teens, he was grabbing everything that he could. Obviously, some things he liked, some things he didn't like. He liked doo-wop. He loved Varese as soon as he heard him. He said he didn't like bebop. He heard some Charlie Parker records, and he said, I didn't know what he was doing. He was just noodling. But I think, again, that could have been part of Zappa's personality. He was quite evasive, and he would say one thing and do another. And I think in many ways that was because of his upbringing. He had a rather uncomfortable upbringing. He didn't trust people. So he tended to be somewhat deceptive in the things that he said. But all the time through his teens, he was listening to every record he could. And he was listening to people like, if you look at interviews with him in various magazines, he listened to Oscar Pettiford, Charles Mingus, Thelonious Monk, Eric Dolphy, tenor player Harold Land. He was listening to Cecil Taylor, Oliver Nelson. He used to go to his local library, the college library. He was going through all the books. He was listening to all the records in the library. He picked up on things like Blues and the Abstract Truth, Stolen Moments by Oliver Nelson. So he was a complete magpie, really.
And when you
And
say that, as soon as you put in Oliver Nelson as an influence, just throw that one in, and then you realise that there's, well, I can't remember which album is it on, the one of the Broadway, The Hard Way. He actually plays Stolen Moments, doesn't he? And you suddenly
oh,
realise, oh God, yes, and you see that Oliver Nelson influence is in there. But the
mm,
thing is that those of us who know Zappa, this part he kind of covered up, didn't he? I feel he was
yeah,
covering up the fact that I think he was quite established coming up to 1966 as someone working in that culture of a composer that's somewhere got bits of jazz and bits of classical and bits of third stream. And he's thinking to himself, and these, of course, these composers are going towards film soundtracks and jingles. It's that era.
mm,
And I think, because the original question was what are his strengths, and I think his strengths as a composer is the fact that he was able to bring these disparate elements together. But I also feel his weakness as a composer is the fact that he brought so many disparate elements together. So I think a lot of people have a difficulty with Zappa because there's no simple melodies and grand structures that you would get, say, if you listen to, I don't know, The Planets, Gustav Holst. That's all sits together all nicely. Whereas Zappa, it's very sort of cut up, and he seems to want to jump around all the time. So when I used to read interviews with him and he said his compositions were like a Calder mobile, he had these weights and gravities. I just think
yeah,
it doesn't sound like that to me. It just sounds like you've cut it together. You've got this bit and you've got that bit and then you've got this bit, and all these individual bits are brilliant. I mean, it's always noticeable when it's not like that.
I think one thing to bear in mind is that is part of it, I think, is the method, the time element, because he was a busy man, he was touring, he was rehearsing, he was taking care of the business side of things. So in between the gaps there, he'd be composing. And he would compose for maybe a week or a few days or hours, wherever he is, flying around the place. And then he would get back home after the tour and put all those pieces together. So I think in some compositions, you can hear that. You can hear, as you're saying, that there are different elements that are being put together, but the way they're put together is really clever. And there is a continuity. And I think, yeah, people will refute that. They will say, well, it just sounds like dissonant clatter to me. But, in terms of the music materials and the way they were assembled, it was very structured and very well thought through. I think I was going to mention, actually, I was in correspondence with Ed Mann a few years ago, just while I was doing my PhD. And he said some really interesting things about, particularly the LSO, the London Symphony Orchestra. And I hadn't realized at the time that there was a lot of deadlines that Zappa had to meet. So he kind of rushed things. And Ed Mann was saying that some of the pieces that he reworked, maybe he felt that he didn't need to rework them. They were just ready to go. But he, being the kind of person he was, just wanted to get it right before the actual rehearsals and performances. So a lot of it was rushed. And I guess, if you think about Bobbin Dacron, there are moments that do sound unbalanced. But then that begs the question as to whether it's an orchestral problem, is it a performance problem, not enough time, trying to play difficult music in a short space of time. There's all these other elements that come into it, but I can see how people would, react that way, the way you're talking about here, in terms of, especially the orchestral music. You have to remember that not many people listen to it. Even Zappa, when he's talking about The Perfect Stranger, I think the initial pressing was 5,000 copies, which was a far cry from the number of copies that were being pressed for the rock albums.
yeah, yeah.
And going back to what you were saying earlier, Geoff, that was quite interesting about, the psychological processes for a person who's a creative person. I guess that plays into the autodidact in a sense that,
Yeah,
and Zappa was the epitome of that, is that
absolutely, yeah.
he did not have any formal training, nobody to tell you what you can and can't do. You know what I
That's right.
mean? It's like
Yeah,
being moved by such a strong inner motivation to learn, to be passionate about music, and not
yeah,
have any sort of, all right, yeah, he did have preferences, of course. It'd be ridiculous not to acknowledged that, but I think he was just open to all different types of music, and no one was telling them that you shouldn't listen to this, you shouldn't listen to that, and you shouldn't put these two styles together. I mean, even if you think about the Mount St. Mary College performances in 1963, the prototypes were already laid there, you know,
That's right,
using
yeah.
finger symbols and these doing improvisations.
Yeah.
It's really an interesting listen, actually, to see how these things began. But that was a culmination of all the different elements, and they just became more prevalent as he developed as a composer throughout the 60s with the Mothers of Invention and then his encounters with orchestras. It just, you know, it's a fascinating development. And that's what I've always found interesting with autodidactics is, you know, Schoenberg was the same. He was working in a bank before he became a composer,
Yeah.
you know.
Something you mentioned in your PhD, I think you talk about the electric compositions, the acoustic compositions, and they were on a continuity in a way. There was a continuity. If you take a composition like Moe's Vacation, you've got the acoustic version, obviously you've got the orchestral version, and Zappa saw them all as the same composition, but one obviously became more complex than the other in a different way. So that represents his idea that everything was good as far as he was concerned. He was interested in everything and it had equal value.
Yeah, equal value. Yeah. I mean, I think people get confused by that. It was how can you place the same amount of value on, you know, one of his songs as opposed to one of his orchestral pieces? You know, I mean, it's that's what I like as well about the autodidact is that, you know, you make up your own mind about what you like. You know, you don't need anyone to tell you, listen to this, you should check this out. You make up your own mind. You look for it yourself. I think that's one of the problems with music in general today is people need to be told what to listen to. They can't make up their own mind, so they just go with the flow, you know. But and it's also that people say Zappa is weird and complex, and I never saw him that way, you know. It's you know, he was very lucid. He spoke with flawless logic. He was, you know, intelligent, creative, pragmatic, contradictory, just like the rest of us. And he just wanted to write music. And I look around every day and I see the things going on that just general human behavior that is socially acceptable. I find some of that bizarre and weird. So Zappa makes perfect sense to me in more ways than just the music, you know.
I think listening to this is such fascinating stuff. I have my own personal thesis about Zappa. And it was after I spoke to Geoff that I started to think that Zappa was on his way as a sort of intelligent, you know, young composer to becoming writing jingles, maybe film soundtracks. You could see that was what his interest was. And when you listen to the early recordings he did pre-66, that's what they sound like. They almost sound like demos for some sort of, you know, almost like cocktail jazz, third stream, all the stuff that would have appeared on television and at that time as a composer. And the first few things he does are film soundtracks. He then acquires Studio Z. So he starts to get a knowledge of the recording studio that nobody in the realm of what is going to become rock music has. He's the only guy that's got a studio to play with. And I think the key thing with Zappa is then when he gets stuck in prison, when he gets arrested, and it doesn't get mentioned like that. They say, oh, he got in trouble and he made it. It's all very funny because they made this sex tape and they bounced up on a bed, you know, and he got sort of. But the fact was that the powers that be at that time distrusted him, saw him as some sort of outside element, you know, that needs to be, and they ensnared him, and he got sent to prison. And those 2 weeks in prison, can you imagine that as a sensitive, creative person? And you come out of that the other side, and before you know it, you know, it's the chrome megaphone, of, you know, and all that stuff on Freak Out. And I think culturally, as we enter the 1960s, the great change that happens as that generation decide that they don't want to do what their parents did and they look for other voices, is that the world opens up to other voices. And so the idea of the autodidact becomes incredibly important, and that Zappa may well be very, very important in late 20th century composition, because he actually ties all these things together. And to compare him to a Steve Reich in a way, though those composers are interesting because they almost nearly got a foothold in rock music, but they didn't go the whole way. Zappa did it, didn't he? He did it. He integrated electric guitar synthesizers, the cultural things that are going on at the time, and this idea that you just talked about, where this sort of cultural relativism that he has, where he doesn't see that there's any difference between Bob Dylan and Mozart. He believes that they're artistically valid. Well, that's something I felt that came into popular music in the 1960s, and it's why we're all here. That idea is why we're all here talking now. And it's that idea that has slowly leaked away from modern popular culture, which is why a lot of people our age are going, "Wow, this isn't, it's not quite as good as it was," because that idea that popular culture could have that gravitas, and Zappa's there in 1966, almost like beyond anybody else. You can talk about Pet Sounds and the Beatles and the Doors, but really, it is his Zapperiness that makes him such a great composer, isn't it? To try and compare him is silly, isn't it?
And again, I think in many ways it comes back to his personality, the individuality that he had. And you mentioned earlier when he went to prison. I think that prison sentence was the culmination of a series of events in his life. I think that was the ultimate thing that made him somewhat bitter and twisted. He'd had a strange upbringing. His father had moved continuously for his work. And I think Zappa went to about 11 different high schools throughout his childhood, his early life. As an Italian, he was teased and bullied at school. Generally, he was a very distrustful kind of person. And that's why, as I mentioned earlier, I think he had this tendency to say one thing and do another. And so he had this outsiderish need to explore different things. And he explored things in a different way to how the average or ordinary person would. So we're experiencing the creativity of the outsider, really. And that in many ways is what Zappa brought to culture, this outsider creativity, this magpie need to explore in a very unique and unusual way.
That's it. I mean, this is incredible because for me, I'm a musician. I'm an autodidact as well. I've never been to music college. I've taught myself. I grew up listening to Led Zeppelin, Miles Davis, Coltrane, all these different musicians. But there's two huge cultural influences on me. One is Frank Zappa, without a doubt. And as much as I loved the complexity and the compositions and all that type, I also loved the countercultural, the examination of culture. I've always been an apologist for all his offensive stuff. I think if you took the offensive stuff out of it just would not have the kick that it has. That has to be in there. Now, the other person that influenced me, and it's exactly at the same time, was the author Colin Wilson.
Oh, yeah.
And
Wow.
Colin Wilson, when I got Colin, I don't know if you're aware of Shannon of Colin Wilson, right? So Colin Wilson is the same thing. He was a British writer. He was an autodidact completely. He'd studied a lot of existentialist philosophy, lots of, and he wrote a book in 1956, I think, 57, called The Outsider.
55.
And on this, he basically creates the framework of what an outsider is, and it's been called the nervous breakdown book. You read this book, and it just is sort of it is incredible. And I read this as a young guy, and it took me down a certain thing. And in my head, I've always had Colin Wilson and Zappa in the same thing, but never said it before because it doesn't make sense. But the aesthetic of the outsider. That is me too. That's what I love. You've hit the nail on the head. That's why Zappa's so great.
Yeah.
That's why he's so great, and why I will put him at the same level as a Coltrane. But Coltrane's all spiritual, and he's trying to do the right thing, and it's all uplifting. Zappa's not like that.
No. An interesting thing. Now, in saying this, I'm not wanting to be reductionist. When you're talking about somebody like Zappa or Colin Wilson, what comes first is the gift, the talent, the fantastic ability. But I think there's a possibility that Zappa might have been on the autistic spectrum, and his daughter, Moon, says that. And if you look at his lifestyle, people think, oh yeah, Zappa was a great family man, fantastic, married all those years. But if you read Moon's autobiography that came out last year, it was quite a crazy family setup. And
Have you read that, Shannon?
Yes, I've read it.
Yeah, I've read bits of it, so I didn't want to bring this in. But what's very interesting here is that we this is more about actually examining Zappa's personality and actually looking at some of the personality flaws. And the underlying question here that we're examining is, do personality flaws create great art? Do you have to be a good person to make great art? Was Zappa a good person, or was he great because he exhibited a thing about his personality which was in one way very honorable and uplifting, but was in another way he wasn't. So he sort of represented the full width of humanity, not just the good bits, if that
yeah,
makes sense.
it's very difficult when you get onto this topic. It's very controversial. A lot of people don't like talking about these kind of things. They say, oh, you're being reductionist and you're trying to reduce everything to personality problems or mental health problems. As I said earlier, first of all, without any doubt comes the great creativity, the talent, the ability, and anything else is secondary. Any personality traits that they might colour or cloud the talent or the ability in certain ways, but you've always got to look at the great creativity in the first place. But then it's interesting to look at these other aspects as well. Moon said, oh yeah, my dad, he was a monk with a lust for groupies. And she wondered whether he was on the autistic spectrum. And I mean, if you take, for instance, he was preoccupied with very restricted patterns of interest. And as he put it, he had a life of obsessive overdubbage. And the recording studio was kind of an alternative universe where he had complete control. So, and he also liked to observe other people and looking at things in terms of theories about the autistic personality. Perhaps he had a problem with theory of mind. In other words, the ways that he tried to understand people. He was a constant observer. He observed the members of his band. He observed the public. He was always trying to draw information, and that might have been partly to do with his possibly autistic spectrum type personality. And talking about Colin Wilson as well, Colin Wilson was a similar kind of guy. He was quite an isolated person. He wasn't bothered about people as a whole. He was happy to be in an isolated situation with his shed full of books or many sheds full of books and concoct his own theories.
I taught at a college, and one of the lecturers knew Colin Wilson's wife,
Yeah.
and she said that he would basically get up in the middle of the night and walk to the window and go, "What the hell is this all about? What is it about?" You know, he wrote all these books, but the thing was, he was just so frustrated at not being able to understand our experience as human beings. You know what it is, and there's a similar thing with Zappa. It's like it's a rigorous metaphysical examination of our experience. So there's a cosmology in Zappa. He has a whole. He was very interested in the metaphysical, and it's like you feel like he wanted you to see the whole this vast composition. His work was just one huge vast composition that represented a universe that he'd created.
What do
And
you
it's
refer to
something
as?
that I find is so compelling.
What do you refer to as the big note?
But yeah, well, the thing is that one of the things that I really why I've taken to YouTube so much and why I love it so much is because I feel I'm creating something which is bigger than me. I don't know what's on my YouTube channel now. I'm coming up to 900 videos.
No.
You know, when I finish this, no one will ever be able to get their head around it. Nobody will. It will sit there beyond me. And I did a video a few months ago where I explained how I'm going to achieve actual immortality through my YouTube. Actually, not metaphorical, actual. You know, and I went,
Hmm.
I was critiquing the whole thing, you know, but basically I was saying when time I finish here, and there's 2,000 videos here, AI will be able to construct me fully.
Hmm.
My kids will be able to sit and chat to me as a hologram in the corner, and there'll be enough there for them to get every aspect of me because there will be 2,000 of videos of me talking about absolutely everything, and I will have created a me, which will be indistinguishable from me. And then you start to think of the whole, the whole idea of consciousness, and these things are dealt with in Zappa's music. Now, returning to the more technical, I feel it's also in his compositions because what Zappa doesn't do is he doesn't create emotive compositions. Does that make sense? He doesn't. I'll give you an example of this. On which album is it? On Burt Weenie Sandwich, Ian Underwood. I feel he has more. It's a very rare time in Zappa's music because Ian Underwood comes in and Zappa seems to be working with him much more equally. And there's a piano piece called ABC. Do you know it, Shannon? I'm sure you know it,
Yeah.
Geoff. You know,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that sounds very much like impressionistic, beautiful. You'd almost like if you wanted to prove to someone what Zappa can do as a composer, you go, well, listen to this. But you know that's not Zappa, is it? It's Ian Underwood. And
Yeah.
Ian Underwood's a brilliant musician and he's able to emote. But Zappa never does this. The stuff.
Um, yeah.
Does that
It,
make sense? You
yeah.
know, if it take something like, I don't know, Arvo Part, there's a model, but when you put him on, it's emotive, isn't it? It's dark and you feel like you're sacred. Zappa's not like that. It's very hard for people to grasp onto
Zappa
it.
does. Zappa does quite often, or sometimes, um, have a piece of music that is quite beautiful, and I think you've remarked about this, Shannon, where it starts off beautiful or very, very sensuous, and then he does something ugly. And people like George Duke commented on that, and they said, "Hey, Frank, why do you always have to spoil it?" And I think that is something to do with, I know I keep coming back to this thing about being on the autistic spectrum, but it was something a little bit perverse where he had to spoil it. And it's very, very sad because I think he could have continued and he could have carried on creating a lengthier piece of beautiful music.
Well,
I mean,
there's always this idea with Zappa that he could have had a number one, he could have written hit singles, he could have done this, he couldn't have. But he never actually does, and it's almost
no,
like Zappa is always self-sabotaging in a way. I mean,
there is that aspect, yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, Shannon, what do you feel about him as a composer in terms of the technical or the processes that he used, where you can see this happening in the compositions? Is it a conscious destruction of, does because I feel watching your videos that often something that is very beautiful and emotive, when he destroys it, it's still there. There's still so in the emotiveness, there is the both of things apply. It's really hard to explain this.
I think there's
When you
another.
look at those beautiful melodies, they still seem to have this very abstract, big Eric Dolphy like interval jumps and mathematical structures are still there. So the thing could fall apart, which Zappa enjoys in a way.
Yeah, I think there's another aspect to it as well. I mean, I hear what you're saying. I think he does that. Yeah, in the orchestral music, you can hear that, whether it's this beautiful textural sound or it's a very idyllic for a moment, and then it's just sort of usurped for some other dissonant kind of sound. What I personally find attractive and appealing about that is that when it happens again, when there's resolution in the sense of some kind of modal harmony, it's just overwhelmingly beautiful because you've had this protracted period of dissonance between it. If you've got beauty all the time, then you can get bored of that, you know? And I think that's what I really like about his music, is that he doesn't just give it to you all the time. And matter of fact, if you think about it, a lot of the stuff that he wrote in the late 60s and early 70s, I mean, there was dissonant music all the time, but he wrote some beautiful melodies, very memorable, gorgeous melodies. You know, Dog Breath Variations, Oh No, and Pound for a Pound, pieces like that. They're just absolutely wonderful. And I think as a composer, after a while, you get bored of writing nice melodies. You don't want to be writing nice melodies all the time. So I think, you know, you're going to move into more experimental areas of composition. And I think that's one of the strengths, is that he, you know, okay, it may not sound like, you know, I'm not going to fulfill the expectations of the listener because I'm here to experiment. I'm here to find out. I'm convinced he was so experimental that he, like, for example, Bob in Dacron is a piece that sounds experimental. Of course, it has a continuity to it, but it's sort of a sense of experimentation here. I'm going to try this out. I've got the LSO at my disposal. Let's just see what that sounds like. And if I can learn from that, okay, it's not, because you always said that no composition's necessarily complete or finished. And I love that sort of idea that you can try something out and be okay with the results, not fulfilling an objective compositional piece. It can be something that's going to inform the next composition. You know, there may be parts in this composition that sound really horrible, but maybe I can modify it for the next composition, or I can learn from that. It's a continual process of learning. And at the end of the day, what he was really interested in was furthering his art, is becoming a better composer, you know, never being satisfied with what he had already achieved. And that's the greatness of it, you know.
Do you feel that with the Yellow Shark, he'd reached some kind of apotheosis? Do you think he'd reached beyond? He got closer to where he was wanting to get?
In terms of the musicians, yes. In terms of having musicians who were really enthusiastic, committed to playing the music correctly, yes. But some of those pieces were arranged years before the Yellow Shark. So, I think that was the remarkable thing about the Yellow Shark, was the fact that he had finally had orchestral musicians who were really committed and wanted to do a good job.
It's interesting when you look at the Yellow Shark, because what he does is what he does a lot. He has an idea, and then rather than sitting down and writing a new composition, he sort of goes into his shed and finds all these bits and cobbles together some sort of Frankenstein thing of something that goes back 20 years, and this melody from here and that from there. And in terms of the influence on me, that's a huge influence. I mean, when I put on something like Thingfish is so awful in a way, but so incredible in its vision. He has this idea of writing a musical, and he has this, and the amount of work, I used to have the booklet of it, you know, you read it, and he's written this huge big musical that's never going to be able to be played or put on. And but by the same token, he's pulling songs from other albums, and you think, well, this can't be your conceptual idea. You haven't thought this through, because you just grabbed that song that wasn't related to this story and tried to just force it into the story. And I find that incredibly inspiring and terrible at the same time. Does that make sense? I mean, I feel that he's at, I was going to say, when you listen to something like Gregory Peccary, that feels a much more complete as a piece. It's awe-inspiring, but yet even then he's still cobbled in certain ideas that he's used before.
But that's a really interesting point, is, you know, it's a composition that sounds complete. It's always going to be subjective. What you term as complete and what I term as complete is going to be completely different. But there are a few examples for me at least, that sound complete. And I wonder whether he would compose them in one sitting, because when you're composing over a period of months,
Yeah.
or a bit here, a bit there, and then you get those sketches, you put them together, and you create a composition out of that. It's different to actually just having one sitting for a long period of time, maybe 2 or 3 months, where you sat down writing the music. There's a different kind of continuity, I suppose. And there are a couple of pieces that stand out as being complete, at least for me. And that's Naval Aviation in Art, although it's a very short piece. Pedro's Dowry, which I believed he composed when he was on holiday in Hawaii, maybe. I'm not sure, but that was like kind of one sitting. The Perfect Stranger, I don't know if that's a one sitting or not, but sounds like it. It sounds complete. And my suspicions that it is a one sitting purely for the fact that Pierre Boulez was going to be conducting it. So I think he pulled all the stops for that. For sure, I'm convinced of it. But
Naval Aviation in Art for me that's the sublime Zappa. If I was going to say, if someone said, you think Zappa's a proper composer, I goes, yeah, have a listen to this. I can remember when I was a kid, I bought Does Human Belong in Music on video. Didn't know anything about it, just got into Zappa. I went home and I put it on in the house. And my dad, I can remember this because he was eating tomatoes on toast. So he's eating these tomatoes on toast and this thing's playing and he's going into He's So Gay and Bobby Brown. And my dad's hearing it and I can't switch it off because if I switch it off, it's as though I've noticed that how offensive it is. And my dad suddenly couldn't take it. He goes, "What the hell is this rubbish that you're listening to? It's absolute rubbish. What is this? I mean, this guy's offensive like this." And he starts up like this, right? And that was it then. And he would come in and goes, "Oh, you like that Frank Zappa?" And it became a joke that I like Frank Zappa. Anyway, when I got the London Symphony Orchestra albums, it was brilliant because I was listening to that album and Naval Aviation in Art was on. And my dad suddenly comes and he goes, "What is this?" And I go, "Why, Dad?" And he goes, "It's unbelievable. It's incredible. Who's this?" And I went, "It's Frank Zappa." And he went, "This is Frank Zappa?" And I went, "Yeah." And in those two events with my dad, that really sums the guy up, doesn't it? The other one that I feel like that is I can't remember the title, the Valdez one off Yellow Shark, which was obviously
Valdez.
Yeah, that is another where you feel that I feel he's incredible at the miniature. And of course, when it came to modern classical, especially the serialists, he was a big fan of Webern, wasn't he? More than Berg and that sort of the big epic. I think he was brilliant at the miniature, and he was brilliant at montage and being able to stick things together. And I think that is where he excelled. However you look at it, his long form compositions are a patchwork of incredible miniatures.
To say that because with Naval Aviation in Art, you talk about the Webern influence, but there is a clear Schoenberg influence in there. I don't know if you've heard the 5 Pieces for Orchestra by Arnold Schoenberg, and it's got the third piece, I think, is called A Summer Morning by the Lake.
Yes, I have heard that. Yeah.
It's based on the Klangfarben technique, which is where the melody is distributed among the orchestra. And it's very reminiscent of that piece. And I know even Zappa mentioned in an interview that he liked that piece. So Naval Aviation in Art, it's a little bit more animated because of those little fragments that happen, there's definitely an influence there. And the Klangfarben melody is something you can hear in other pieces, like America from the Yellow Shark. I think they did a live version. It was originally done on the Synclavier. That's pointillistic, it's borrowing that idea from pointillism, Seurat and painters like that, and just sort of, expressing it from a musical standpoint. So just to quickly explain, you have a melody usually played on one instrument, but in Klangfarben melody, pointillism music, the melody is distributed among different instruments. So you may have a trumpet playing the first note, and then, the bassoon plays the second note, and each instrument is playing parts of the melody. And if you listen to America, that's an amazing feat because they're dealing with irregular rhythms. It's not just straight kind of rhythms, and they're all trying to pick up their part within the tuplet. I'm playing the 4th note on a septuplet. You're playing the 7th note, and then that's not easy,
But the other rock band that did that was Gentle Giant, which I believe Zappa also he appreciated Gentle Giant, you know. So there's certain aspects that go, because the one thing I want to move on to is the rock aspect of this now, is that I've felt, as much as I listen to the orchestral stuff, I actually don't think the orchestral stuff is artistically as great as the rock stuff. And the reason is because with the rock stuff, Zappa takes on the idea of being a composer and operating as a composer would, but with a rock band, and that is far more. Um, it's far more avant-garde and far more culturally. It's much more innovative to have done that. And I think when you hear his melodies arranged for a large ensemble, which includes distorted electric guitars, but it's also got like orchestral percussion and all that operating together, is far more interesting than when he just writes something for the London Symphony Orchestra. That's my personal thing, and I think this is one of the problems. It's very easy to go, oh, he wrote for orchestra, so he's like a proper composer. But actually, I think the real artistic achievements would be his use of the rock band and his use as the recording studio. And I cannot think of another modern classical composer of that period that's anywhere near that, really. What do you think about that?
Perhaps he didn't get enough opportunity to use the orchestra. And okay, he used the rock group as his arena because it was available to him. He didn't have enough access to an orchestra. And if orchestra had been more easily available, we would have had even more innovative
I'm
orchestra
sure that's the
music.
case, but my point is that would have that been not as artistically great? You know, because who else at that time? Why did John Cage or whoever it is, Pierre Boulez? Why did, I mean, some people did. They did write for rock bands, didn't they? I know that my friend Kevin Gammond worked with Louis Anderson in a band called Ocatus, which was a sort of
Yeah,
an attempt to bring modern classical composition into sort of rock band settings. So but it was that was happening in the late 70s, not in the 60s. So I feel that that although it's harder to appreciate, I think the innovation is the fact that, so for example, in terms of a composer, he's used electric guitar unlike any other composer in 20th century music. Who has used the electric guitar, the most important instrument of the late second half of the 20th century? What other composer used that? Glenn Branca, perhaps much later.
I think they're two different things. The way I see it, they're two separate things.
Really?
Yeah, for me, I don't really say one's more innovative than the other. I think the innovations that you may be referring to are a result of constraints of being a classical composer and wanting to function within that idiom and not having the means to do it
yeah,
continuously because of the expense and the logistics involved. I think he had to be innovative in order to get that music played in a rock setting. So pushed his bands to play things that were unconventional for a
yeah,
rock band. And I
yeah.
think those are the innovations you may be referring to, Andy. The
It's not
two.
just that; it's the fact that for example, his favorite Black Sabbath tune was Supernaut. I've talked at this at length on another video, because this video is going to come out as a companion piece to a reaction video I've done to another YouTube channel that has basically could try to do a hatchet job on Frank Zappa. That's what the channel does. It's called something like I can't remember. It's called something like Your Favorite Band Is Crap or something like that. And they basically went for Zappa, and they got so much wrong, and it was so just not right. It just wasn't right. And at one point they said Zappa's favorite Sabbath tune was Iron Man, and I thought, well, it's not. It was Supernaut. And that in 1973, when they were doing the Sabotage album, Led Zeppelin turned up, and there's this jam between Zeppelin and Black Sabbath. John Bonham said, I want to jam on Supernaut. And that was Zappa's favourite tune. And it's my favourite Black Sabbath tune as well. And the reason is because of that riff. And I don't think there's any composer in the 20th century that understood the rock riff. Zappa understood the rock riff. He understood the blues. He understood the spice that's in the sound of the blues. And those were the things he was utilizing. And it wasn't just a pastiche. You weren't always in this interesting to use it. He properly utilized it in the same way as Duke Ellington would utilize Johnny Dodds on alto saxophone, or Bubba Miley on the trumpet. He was composing for the people in his band, which I think is an incredible thing. And I feel with the orchestral stuff, when I hear it, it lacks that edge. There's never going to be a Stevie Spanking with the London Symphony Orchestra. Does that make sense? For me, I like Marquis Sun's Chickens Off Them or Us. That's the perfect Zappa composition, because it's rock. It's got distorted guitar. It's got drums on it, and it's still a composition. Does that make sense? That's when I find him so interesting. With the orchestral stuff, I used to have to really struggle to try and hear it like it was a rock band to appreciate it as Zappa.
That's what I think if you listen to it with that in mind, you will have problems with it. I think you have to separate the
Yeah.
two.
I do too. Yeah.
Because my favorite orchestral stuff is orchestral favorites. I think that album's incredible because it just has this edge. It sounds like a rock band. It sounds like an expanded rock band up to that. Whereas the orchestral stuff sounds like it's established as a thing. And I think reading all the frustrations Zappa had with the orchestra, it shows that he couldn't quite do what he does. I'm trying to explore the sort of negative aspects here. What do you feel about the Synclavier stuff in this? Is that like really, forward thinking, innovative, really, foretelling the way music will be made in the future? And, most modern classical composers will probably be using Sibelius to create their compositions. How do you think, was that also ahead of its time, or do you feel that they don't stand up in the same way as, say, the orchestral stuff? Where would you put those?
I think, again, in some ways, this relates to his personality. He said that he used the Synclavier because he didn't have to use real musicians. He could get the Synclavier to do exactly what he wanted. And he didn't have to worry about musicians not playing the right notes or being ill or not turning up. But in my personal opinion, the Synclavier music, it does tend to sound a little bit cold and impersonal, and I prefer the real orchestral music. So in some ways, I think really using the Synclavier was a bit of a cop-out. It was a very, very interesting experiment, and of course Zappa appreciated it greatly, but on balance, I think the orchestral music wins out.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Back in the early 90s, I had a friend called Ian Stonehouse who went on to become the head of electronic music at Goldsmiths, but we were just kids when we were young. And he also hooked up with Ben Watson at that time. And so we were getting these sort of reports back from Zappa that he was working on the masterpiece of his whole career, Civilization Phase 3. And we heard all this stuff, and I got so excited. I thought, and then he was very ill as well, and he was trying to get this thing finished. And I thought, he is going to produce this huge when you get the CD and you open that book up and you see what's in there, and it's the culmination of everything right back to Lumpy Gravy with the piano and the whole unit. And when I listened to it, I was let down. That's the biggest letdown I've ever had from Frank Zappa, was Civilization Phase 3. Now, the stuff I liked on there was where the harmonic, not the harmonic, the timbral palette was reduced, where he brought the sounds down. There's my favorite composition, I don't know the name of it. He's dealing just with string sounds. He's got guitar samples, harp samples, and it's absolutely incredible. But Enlight, the great big composition, the epic, his masterpiece, it just sort of passed me by, and nobody mentions this stuff whatsoever. They'll mention Jazz from Hell maybe, but this great double album of with the what do you feel about that? I have thought of doing a whole video on Civilization Phase 3 because it was such a big build up, and now it's not mentioned whatsoever. I mean, did you look at that, Shannon, at all in terms of the compositional elements.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the Synclavier, it seems to me to be the logical next step a composer would take
Yeah.
if you could afford one at the time,
Mm.
is that, you're continuously composing and you don't want to always want to wait around for musicians to play it. So you can use this device, this piece of technology that's going to play back instantly what you've written. And I think, as Geoff was saying, it was an experiment. Whether the music produced on it was as good as the orchestral stuff is a matter for discussion for sure. But for me, excuse me, the Synclavier really illuminates the importance of the musicians. And we're talking about Zappa. Of course, Zappa's a composer, right? But I think sometimes we tend to forget the importance of the musicians that played in his band. His music would never have sounded that way if it wasn't for those great musicians. And they often get overlooked, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
And they were a really important ingredient in that music. Not only did they bring their sort of technical skills, their personalities as well, their stories, their folklore, as Zappa talks about in his book. And that's what makes that music interesting. I'm still not going to join you with that one, Andy, in terms of it being, better. Either one is better than the other in terms of the rock music and the orchestral music. I still see them as two separate things, but definitely in terms of the rock music, you have those, elements that make it very appealing, very intriguing to listen to. One of the things that really inspired me was the way he talked. Just his voice.
Yeah, without a doubt.
The way he addressed the audience and the things that he said. When I was young, as a teenager, just getting into it was just like, wow,
But also his love of doo-wop and his ability to work with a large number of vocalists, to have such incredible vocalists, to have Ray White, Bobby Martin, Ike Willis in the band at the same time, be dealing with, 4 and 5 part harmony, integrating that into every different style of music. And nobody goes, isn't that incredible? Who else has done that? Nobody. It's such an artistic achievement. I don't feel the orchestral music quite has that punch of these incredible things that are going on in it, where you go, I've never heard this before, and you almost like take it for granted. You listen to something like side 2 of You Are What You Is, that whole Society Pages, which for me that really hangs together, even though they're different tracks. The whole of that side hangs together, and just listen to the vocals and what's going on.
And another thing is that the musicians sometimes compose stuff, and they weren't always credited for it. You hear Don Preston talk about this. Arthur Barrow talked about You Are What You Is, composing parts for that. Tommy Mars composed the keyboard part for Yo Mama. Not taking anything away from Zappa.
No.
He was obviously, it's pointless mentioning it really, but just it doesn't seem to be any kind of reference to those written parts. You have Uncle Remus, where George Duke had written, he's got a credit for it. But a lot of the times these, we take for granted the importance of the musicians as well, not necessarily in composition, although, they helped out here or there, but just in terms of their personalities and technical skills. And that's why, going back to the Synclavier, it's a little bit disappointing, I suppose, if you're comparing the two, But I still think there's some really interesting things in the Synclavier music as well. And I did like that CD, Andy.
Yeah, I loved Jazz from Hell when it came out. I thought it was amazing, and those tunes are brilliant. G-Spot Tornado is just brilliant, Night Music, absolutely brilliant. And then when I got Civilization Phase 3, it just didn't seem to have the tunes. It's just that Jazz from Hell has, Jazz from Hell. Also, when it came out, it was in my local record shop. It was a big deal, and the cover was great. Zappa was on the front, and you took it home, and it was almost like a rock album because he had track 1, track 2, track 3. And I find this far more compelling. I love that, the in between of all this, and I think Zappa's brilliant at juggling those things. And I feel, having this conversation, that I've realized that more than anything else is that I like Zappa to be talking about, farts, having these incredible compositions, incredible solos. It's all that I love. For me, the perfect Zappa composition would be something like As a Ship to Arriving there's a ship to
Ship arriving too late to save a giant whale.
yeah, and the way that goes into envelopes and then teenage prostitute, that is just sublime. And the thing that I love about it is there's two Zappa solos that are incredible guitar solos, and they're both like a dialectic of his two guitar approaches is embedded in within all of this, and it covers so much ground. And I think it's that for me that makes him one of the greatest composers of the 20th century. And I do, having talked to you and the other things you've thrown in, I do think he's one of the greatest composers of the 20th century. I would say he's the greatest of the second half of the 20th century. He's better than the rest.
Yeah.
You think?
I think, yeah, absolutely. It's interesting the point that Chanan just made as well about Zappa's voice. And I think that brings in yet another aspect. The way that Zappa is part of American culture. He's part of post-World War II American culture. And he brings in all those influences. And if you listen to Zappa's voice, the quality of his voice is in a long line from people like Groucho Marx, Orson Welles, people like that. An American comedian, singer, Phil Harris. He's carrying that cultural tradition of American culture, and it all blends in to the whole picture. Just to add in another element in terms
Oh,
of
it's so true, because as a English young person without the internet, listening to Zappa, there was all these things that I didn't know what they were, like a Naugahyde chair or what, all these things he would go on about. It was like, and sometimes I think I didn't even know what he's saying there. And then you'd go through, and then you'd pick up, oh, these are American cultural references, and I sort of got a great idea, and actually could fill in the blanks of when my friends would be chatting about America. Go, well, in America they have this and they have that, or that's the equivalent of what we would have here. One of the things I'm going to move on to now is because this month I've had the Simon Phillips interview. We've got this one, and then I've got this sort of takedown of these, anti-Zappa people. The Simon Phillips interview is very interesting because Simon played on the El Shankar album, which is a Zappa album, but it's the only English Zappa album. And I don't think this has been spotted. This is the English Zappa album. Zappa arrives in London to do this El Shankar album, and he pulls in these musicians. He gets suggested musicians to play. And what Simon says is that Simon could play the stuff. And he said, but some of the players they got in, they couldn't read music. And he said the first composition that they recorded was Darlene. And Zappa comes in with this composition, and he said, Simon Phillips looked at it, and he said he could not read it at sight. He said it was too hard. He said so he decided to just play the time signatures and do his own thing. He said, but Zappa was pushing him. He said, so Simon Phillips is here, really can read, but he's been pushed a little bit beyond. And he said, but the guitarist on the album did not understand time signatures. Can you imagine getting the gig? And he said Zappa didn't sack him, or he just pushed him to this level. And Simon said that when you listen to that tune, Zappa had actually created a balance where everybody was beyond themselves and they were doing something that was really interesting, and the tune's made great. So if you listen to it, so the guitarist is actually creating such an interesting part because he doesn't understand what's going on in the time signatures, and Zappa has been able to pull all these things together. And for me, that's the real genius of Zappa. And I think when we look at a lot of the things that are going on musically now, especially instrumentally, if you look at Instagram players and all this sort of stuff, I don't think they would be doing what they were doing if Zappa hadn't been able to push the music forward with all these different things. I had students coming out and doing transcriptions of people's conversations because I played them Zappa doing that, and one of my students, Miron, ended up getting quite big on the internet doing this. It's like mountaineering, isn't it? Nobody can climb that mountain, and as soon as somebody does, then everyone starts to climb it. And I think Zappa opened up so many avenues musically that we don't realize now. That musicians do so much now that comes from Zappa. So when you look at like that there's that drummer with the beard, the guy, and he's just this virtuoso drummer, and he'll Estos Branzi, I can't say his name. Huge, millions of views, and when I watch what he's doing, there's so much Zappa in it.
Mm.
Does that make sense? And I think that's his legacy in a way.
Yeah, yeah. Agree. Yeah.
I'll just check my checklist because there was one thing. Well, we were on that. We've actually followed that a little bit because I've gone through. So to finish up, what do you think his legacy will be as a composer? Do you think in 200 years' time people will be looking back? Because of course he famously said no one would remember him.
I think I think it's anything is possible. That's something that he sort of left, that indelible mark that anything is possible in music. How else you'll be remembered, I'm not sure, but
no, I would say his legacy is that you can be eclectic, that you can choose from every avenue. And I think quite a lot of composers have followed that kind of avenue. Not that he's the same in any way, really, but if you take somebody like Mark Anthony Turnage, he lifts from all sorts of areas. He lifts from jazz, from contemporary classical music. So in a way, Zappa led the way in terms of being eclectic and being able to choose from all sorts of disparate areas. And in many ways, I think that is probably one of his most important legacies.
Well, I think we return right to what Shannon raised at the beginning of this, which is it's all about repertoire, isn't it? If those compositions are good, then they're going to be chosen as repertoire. And we are 30 years after he died, and that has not gone away. There are more and more all sorts of different ensembles playing it, more musicians that are able, I think, to understand what Zappa was doing, more musicians that understand, for example, tuplets, because it's incredible when you read interviews with incredible drummers in the late 70s that are, because Simon Phillips says on my interview, said there was this like 7/4, and he was like going, what? No one had seen this before, but now there's so many musicians who can play that type of stuff. So I think the fact that the repertoire has carried on and people will play these compositions, I think hopefully you could see that, 100 years time, may well be seen as a composer from this period, which people play. It'd be lovely to think that that's the case. Whether the the Bobby Browns will stay around as culturally, I don't know. I mean, sometimes culturally, I wish he was still around, or sometimes I wish he was still here to, comment on Trump or, stuff that's happening at the moment. I feel like I've missed him. That's the where I've missed him more than anything else. He's been able to have things brought down and brought down and made funny, and he could poke fun so well at stuff that and I've carried that on there's so much Zappa on my channel. There's so much high and low arts. There's so much me talking philosophically, but also my takedowns of people are not really because I don't like them. It's much more of a poking fun at something that you shouldn't poke fun at.
Yeah.
And now all their houses are burning down.
Does Zappa's house still exist, or has it been burned down? What's happening on Laurel Canyon?
I don't know.
God, it's terrible.
You see, for me, this is the thing where that's my Zappa mind, is that with all this stuff that's going on at the moment in terms of the sort of entertainment elite, okay, the 20th century, the technologies that emerged meant that you sort of had a Mount Olympus of stars emerge, film stars, pop stars, and we all looked up to them or us, like Zappa said. There's a them or us, and that is for me the overriding cultural structure in terms of the arts and entertainment in the 20th century, and we are seeing that collapse.
Yeah.
We are seeing that collapse. And so when I see those fires and all their houses are burning down, as awful as it is, I can't help but go, my God, this is like artistically, after all this stuff that's happened, after the fact that they threw everything at trying to get Biden and Kamala in, didn't they? The entertainment industry did everything and it didn't work.
No.
And now they're sort of, well, what would we do? No one wants to watch films anymore. There's no real pop stars. And now their houses are burning down. It's like, and I would love for Zappa to be around to sort of comment on that.
Yeah. It would be great.
I miss that. But I have that in me. I am not scared to raise that and say that and say these things. Every time I'm a bit scared to say something, I think, well, Frank Zappa would say he'd say far worse than this.
No, we agree with you. We miss you, Frank. We miss you.
No, I miss him so much. I really do. I can remember waking up in '93, and I was lying in bed, put the radio on, and it was on the radio, and I started crying. I really did, and he's been such an important musician to me, and I think he's great because he's flawed, like Miles Davis. Miles Davis and him occupy a certain thing in my head. They're brilliant because they're flawed. And they show those flaws, and most great artists, they try and cover those up in a way.
Yeah, flawed artists. That's another game altogether, really. Worth talking about at some later date.
Well, it's been very inspiring. I feel that there's been an arc of energy, and I think we've now got to the end of it, haven't we? We're definitely at the end of this one. And there's so much there. As you were talking, you were throwing so much out there, and it was like joining the dots with what I have thought for 40 odd years about Zappa. And so I think this has been a very, very good video. I think this has been my best one on Zappa, actually, having you two guys in. So I do thank you so much, Shannon and Geoff. It's lovely for you to come in, and I'm so happy that I've hooked you two up. You must get together for a chat, I think.
Nice to meet you, Sharon.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Geoff. And thank you for putting it together, Andy. Thank you very much.
Yes, lovely. Shall we say goodbye to them all?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got to get my finger on the stop. Because we have to stop it as we're saying goodbye. accidentally pressed stop. I'm so sorry. There was a bit of a gap then, there wasn't there?
Yeah.
It was like, I'm going to have to edit this together now. It's going to take me hours to do that. Oh, God. I can't believe it. Pressed it by accident. I was trying to do a good ending. Ruined it all. It was all good up until then. And now it's gone rubbish. I do apologise. We got to do. Shall we try and do a proper ending? I don't know whether I want to put this in now. I think she just stopped dead. I don't know. What do I do, chaps? Come on, we talked about aesthetics. What's the right artistic decision here? Do I just put it up with this bit on, or do I just let it go dead and just let it go click halfway off? And people go, what happened then? Which is what would Frank do?
Let it click off.
I know, but he loved editing stuff together. Shall I just edit some random things together? I will do that, actually. There will be a little montage at that point. If I'm going to have to stick these files into bloody my video editing and mess around with that, there's going to be something weird in that gap. And you guys aren't going to know what it is. I'm going to do a zapper in the gap. I'm going to try my best to do that because I believe these mistakes happen for a reason. Frank is watching over us, and he made my finger press down by accident then, and I have to honour. Thank you, Frank. I'm going to put something in there. Shannon, if you want to send me some email anything across, if you've got a little bit of music, I'll do the visuals. Could you send me something across? Looks like a 40 seconds.
Send me the visuals first, and then I'll send you something.
No, you send me. Xenochrony, you can't control it. I'm going to pull in something random. Just send me a bit. Will you do that, Shannon?
All right.
Is that all right? You can't see it.
Yeah.
You've got to surrender. You've got to surrender to what I'm about to do. This is proper Zappa-ness. This is the truth, isn't it? Those musicians, they would have worked for him. They would have no idea what was going to come on that album. I will do that at the end. Thank you, Frank. That was brilliant. That's the best way to finish it. So those of you who just wonder what the hell happened then, I pressed stop by accident. And then we have now, because that has happened, I'm going to respond to it and I'm going to put in a little bit. And Shannon, who being the incredible musician, will send something over as his. I've asked him cheekily to do that. If he decides not to do that, I will respect that and I'll put something else in. But hopefully, because I've dropped it all on him. I've dropped it on him, and this is just made the video. I feel so much happier now, chaps. I really do. It feels like an Andy Edwards video now. So shall we now say goodbye properly? And I'll try and get my finger on the button without pressing it. Frank, get off my finger, Frank. I know what you're trying to do. Naughty. Right. Are you ready? Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.